And thank you, Deanna, for inviting me. And thank you for coming out to this talk today about Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Barbados and history that you never learned in school. My name is Evan Weiner. I've been doing this kind of thing since 1971. I was at Spring Valley High School in Rockland County, and I had a teacher by the name of Joe Dionisio. It's 11th grade English. And he looked at me and he said, "Student," and he always was like that, student, middle finger points at you. And 49 years later, I still talk to him and he still calls me student. Anyway, he says, "You have a good voice. How'd you like to be on radio?" And I said, "I want to be on radio in the worst way." And I was on WRKL radio, which you could get in your neck of the woods, 910 on the dial. And it was every Tuesday, 3:45 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the worst show possible, Tiger Talk. But it was the start. And not only was it a start there, but Joe D opened the doors for me at the Nyack Journal News, along with the Bergen Record, when the Bergen Record was quite the presence back in 1972, 71, when I was 15 years old. I did 3 separate stints at the Bergen Record: high school, after college, and then in the early 2000s. I was doing op-ed pieces for Peter Grad. By the time I was 21 years old, I was doing some news for WNEW Radio in New York. William B. Williams and the nicest guy I've ever met in showbiz, Julius LaRosa, who was a member of that prestigious club called the Romeos, retired old men eating out. And the reason I got on there when I was 21, John Lindsay, the former mayor of New York City, told me he was running for Senate, state of New York. I get a call from Henry Marcotte over at WNEW. He says, "How would you like to do that story for us?" I said, "Sure. How much are you going to pay me?" $10, sold. And with that, I was on WNEW, 1130 on the dial, and I'm sure some of you listened to that. This talk, Washington, of course, it's President's Day on Monday, Washington, Jefferson, and Barbados. And I knew nothing about most of this talk, except I speak on cruise ships. And I go to Barbados when the cruise ships go. I've been there too many times. And I go up to Eastern Canada, Quebec, Nova Scotia, Cape Breton. And there's a lot of history that I did not learn at Spring Valley Junior High School with Mr. Gates or Mr. Schwartz or Mr. Bray or Mr. Levine or Mr. Lane. They just never really told me the story that I'm going to tell you. And most of you probably have never heard this version of the story. I did a couple of years ago a talk up in Glen Rock at the library, same topic, and there were 42 historians there. 41 of them never heard this story. One did. And he told me afterwards, he said, "You've been traveling." I said, "Yes, I have." Anyway, that is George Washington on the steps of the museum across the way from Central Park West. And George, of course, is allegedly the father of the country. But you will find that George Washington was missing in action for a good chunk of pre-American history. That is the Washington Monument in Washington. A couple of years ago, I took the picture because hey, the Washington Monument was undergoing some rehabilitation at that time, and I just looked at it and said, "Yeah, that's a proper picture." Let's go to Barbados. I've been in Barbados too many times, and a lot of American history, believe it or not, probably started in Barbados. In 1649, Barbados was intimately involved in the English Civil War, and that resulted in the defeat of King Charles I in 1649, and the rise to power of Oliver Cromwell as the Lord Protector. There's the English Civil War. Some of the loyalists to King Charles fled, ended up in Barbados, where they became the rebels after being the loyalists. Anyway, the war comes to Barbados in 1651 and ends with the Charter of Barbados. They didn't want to lose their head, the royalists, but they all of a sudden start saying taxation without representation, taxation without representation. They bought property in Barbados, and they figured better to swelter in the heat than lose your head like the king. The Charter of Barbados was agreed upon January 11th of 1652. Yeah, I am sharing the slides. They should be on there. Hang on one second. I'm going to stop the share and put it back on.
I found the piece that says share content. It didn't have that on. Thank
Oh,
you.
you didn't have it on.
Yeah, I guess because other stuff was coming on my screen.
Okay, so everybody should have this share content now. Okay, so back to 1651. The Charter of Barbados was agreed upon January 11th, 1652. And of course, they're all Englishmen, and Englishmen like to meet in the tavern. And there's a tavern, or was a tavern, in Ostends. And they meet on January 17th to talk about this war that is ending. There were 23 articles in this charter addressing religious liberty, Article 1, free trade, taxation, and the authority of the local assembly. If that sounds familiar, it should be, because all of that is in the Declaration of Independence. I don't know, maybe Jefferson plagiarized something, who knows? The Civil War and the Charter of Barbados, they're done on January 17, 1652, and Barbados is able to live happily ever after. Well, maybe not, but at least as of January 17, 1652. Now, how'd I find this out? Well, I'm on a cruise ship, and my wife and I are waiting for a bus. And then we said, why are we waiting for a bus? The cruise ship's only a half mile from here. But we saw this plaque in Bridgetown. And it says, from this vantage point, you could have witnessed one of the naval theaters of the English Civil War, 1642 through 51. Sir George Askew commanded a naval blockade of the island of Barbados from his ship, the Rainbow. In Ostens Bay, from October 1651 to January 1652, Askew's naval forces were sent to subdue local royalists led by the governor, Lord Willoughby. The stalemate ended in a treaty between the royalists and the parliamentarian factions after the final conflict in Ostens. The Charter of Barbados was signed on 11 January 1652 at the Mermaid Tavern in Ostens. It guaranteed Barbadian colonists their rights to land, local control of taxation, liberty of conscience, access to the courts of law, and limited free trade. And they go on to say that's the basis of the Declaration of Independence in the United States. No taxes, customs, imports, loans, or excise shall be laid or nor levied on any of the inhabitants of this island without their consent in the General Assembly. Article 3 of the Charter of Barbados, signed at the Mermaid Tavern. The Mermaid Tavern in Ostens was the site of the battle between the Royalists and the Roundheads, which resulted in the signing of the Charter of Barbados, Treaty of Ostens. The articles are rendition of the island from proprietary rights to the Commonwealth Parliament on January 11th, 1652. Now, this treaty, now you may say, what's this got to do with Washington and Jefferson? Well, everything. This treaty was to ensure that Barbados accepted the authority of the English Parliament and also prevented local taxes from being raised without local consent. Another plaque in Barbados, in Bridgetown. The Treaty of Ostens, that was negotiated and signed at the Mermaid Tavern and in 1652, and its concept of no taxation without representation was the inspiration for the Boston Tea Party in 1773 and subsequently included in the American Declaration of Independence. Should be 1776, but they have it there, 1775. So Barbados is already playing a role in American history even before America becomes a country. And that is Thomas Jefferson. And that is at the Jefferson Memorial over, now you got to pay for parking to get in there. That was one of the last days that you could go not pay for parking over there. But that, of course, is in Washington, D.C. Barbadians historians think that the charter did influence the American Declaration of Independence because George Washington, on his visit to Barbados, and would be the only time that George Washington left the North American continent, would have been acquainted with the charter somehow and may have talked to Thomas Jefferson about it. And if it wasn't him, well, then it might have been the Barbadians who moved to the Carolinas and Virginia that might have talked to Jefferson about this particular charter, which may have been lifted from somewhere else, but this is what they agreed upon in Barbados. Now, how did George Washington get to Barbados? Well, it's a family crisis. Lawrence Washington's his half-brother, and he's suffering from tuberculosis. And the doctors of those days said, you know what? We really do think, if you go spend the winter in the tropics.
Interrupt. We can't hear you.
Okay, hold on one second.
Oh, no, now we can hear you. Now we
Okay.
can hear you.
Okay. No
Thank
problem.
you. Sorry.
All right, let's start this again. So Lawrence Washington has this problem. He's suffering from tuberculosis, and the doctors of his day said, hey, go down to the Caribbean. You'll be cured. Everything will be cool. You'll come back. You'll feel well. So Lawrence is looking around and looking around. Hey, who's going to take this trip to Barbados with me? He looks at his wife, and his wife said, no can do. Well, why can't you do it? Well, you know, we've had 2 kids that were stillborn. We have 2 little ones that are alive. I want to stay behind here. I'll watch the kids. Go find somebody else, and good luck, and get healed real quick. So he's looking around, and he says to his half-brother, George, what you doing the next 4 months? And George said, really nothing. You know, here I am. I'm 19 years old. I have nothing to do. Yeah, let's go. So George Washington gets on a boat and goes with his sick brother Lawrence to Barbados, not knowing that this trip is going to change not only his life, but the course of the colony that he is living in Virginia at that time. So the brothers head down to Barbados, and they sailed on something called the Success, a small trading sloop. Now, I got to figure that they left somewhere, maybe by Norfolk, Virginia, and it took them 6 weeks to get there. On a big cruise ship now, it'll take you 2.5 to 3 days to get from Virginia to Bridgetown, Barbados. And George Washington was taking notes. And these are the notes that are available at his Mount Vernon, Virginia home. He called the Atlantic Ocean fickle and merciless. Notice how he spelled it, M-E-R-C-I-L-I, not an E-I-S-S, the fickle and merciless ocean. When they do get there, they're going to be spending time at this place, which has been restored, which isn't far from the beach. It's Gedney Clark's house, and he's a relative of Lawrence Washington, who says, hey, come on down, we're going to give you the house, and you'll get better here. Washington recorded the weather, details about sailing, the fish they caught or tried to catch. George wasn't much of a fisherman. They included dolphin, pilotfish, sharkfish, barracudas, or tigerfish. By November 2nd, 1751, they docked, and they were very happy to get off. And they docked right around here, Carlisle Bay, but I doubt that this sign was there when they got there, explaining about the coral reefs and all this other kind of stuff. And this is one of the big beaches in Barbados. It's also where the port is in Bridgetown, but I doubt that they got that kind of greeting. The English settled Barbados in 1627. That's a bit more than 2 decades later. Sugar would become king. There'd be sugar trade, there'd be slave trade, and Barbados would become the crown jewel of what was called British America. Bridgetown, where Washington landed, was one of the most populous cities in British America, which was the 13 colonies, which weren't which when Washington got there were colonies, but they weren't colonies when Barbados became big. Also Canada. And probably Bridgetown was the biggest area in terms of people that Washington ever saw in his life, young life at that point. Gedney Clark was Lawrence Washington's wife's uncle, and he invited them to the house. They went, although George had some reluctance. In fact, he put it in his diary. He had some reluctance because Mrs. Clark had smallpox, and he really didn't want to get smallpox. After all, he's traveling with his brother who's sick with tuberculosis, and now he's going to a house with smallpox. But Washington was right in this sense. He was going to get it, and within 2 weeks he was stricken with the disease. He would recover, and that would do him well during the American Revolution when other guys that he was leading had smallpox. He was immune, but he got it while he was there. Washington also somehow was taken in by the British Navy. For some reason, they looked at him, they probably said, hey, he's 6'4", and he's a young guy, and he's a commanding looking guy. So maybe we should actually try to recruit him for the British Army or the British Navy. After all, he's living in the colonies. So Washington gets to see how the Navy operates, and he starts writing about what this is all about in his mind. And he figures out Barbados actually was one entire, I-N-T-I-R-E, entire instead of entire with an E, fortification. And he was right. It was surrounded by cannons and walls. They're still there. That's part of a resort now down there. And he figured out, hey, you know what? This is a military installation. The brothers would go home. Lawrence Washington would die of tuberculosis going to the tropics, and the heat didn't help him. And he dies in July of 1752. George Washington is 20 years old, doesn't really know what he's going to do with his future, but he becomes intrigued by the military after meeting everybody. Washington lived in a rather small world. He had his plantation that he lived in. He wasn't that rich, because if he had money, they would have sent him to a posh school in Britain and polished him off, but he never went there. So he was in Virginia, and going to Barbados, his little world was expanded. And while in Barbados, he made contact with very influential people in Bridgetown, and he would use those people to guide his career a quarter of a century later. But he's back in Virginia. He's 20 years old or so, and he says, I got to do something with my life. So he says, I'm joining the Army, and he does. He dedicated himself to advancement in the military, more so than anybody else in Virginia at his age. And apparently he was gung-ho because he saw the commission in the regular British Army establishment or military establishment. Think of that. He wanted to be a Brit. He wanted to be in the British Armed Forces. That was an ambition that may have been prompted and probably stimulated by his experience in Barbados, hanging out with the British Navy. In December of 1752, Washington makes his move. He's only 20 years old, but he's now in the military, and he's now the commander of the Virginia militia. Big guy, smart guy, 6'4", towers over everybody, so that would make him a good commander, at least material-wise. He did see action in the French and Indian War, and eventually was put in charge of all of Virginia's militia forces. Except George Washington, as you find out, wasn't all that great a field general. He got in trouble quite a bit. In 1753, Washington was sent as an ambassador. He's 21 years old, as an ambassador from the British Crown, King George III, to French officials and Indians as far north as the present-day Erie, Pennsylvania. In 1754, he was there to assist the construction of a fort at present-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But he gets into a little trouble before he gets to what would become Pittsburgh. He and some of his men, accompanied by Indian allies, ambushed a French scouting party. Its leader was killed, and the French were fuming, and they responded. Of course, they didn't like English anyway, French Indian War, all that other stuff. The French responded by attacking fortifications that Washington erected following the ambush. He surrenders. He's released on parole, goes back with his troops to Virginia and tries to figure out, okay, what happened? And he leaves. He's gone. He decides, you know what? I can't do this. I'll become a surveyor. So he becomes a surveyor. But he becomes involved again in the French and Indian War for the English. And this is 1756. And in the first year of his command of the Virginia Regiment, Washington got a reputation. You don't mess with him. He shaped the unit into one of the best provincial military units in the colonies. He had rigorous discipline. He punished transgressions with the lash. He hanged deserters. He just hanged them. That's it. You're gone. we're through with you. We're just going to kill you. But he wasn't very good on the battlefield. A number of battlefield losses, and then fights with the governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie. That's it. He's gone. He returns to Williamsburg, goes back to his farm, and he's going to live out the rest of his life. And he's no more than 25 years old at this point. And he resigns from the Virginia militia. So he becomes a farmer, and he misses all of the action that would set up the Revolutionary War in 1775 and 1776. He gets married. He's 27 years old, almost 27 at the time. He gets married on January 6th, 1759. He marries Martha Dandridge Custis, Martha Washington, and he decides to go into politics. He's a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses. And for the next 16 years, between 1759 and 1775, he lives the quiet life of a plantation owner and a local politician. And that should be the end of George Washington. We should never hear from him after that. This is what he missed. That's Quebec City. Again, I'm on cruise ships when I'm allowed on cruise ships. And one of my favorite places to go is Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Quebec City. And that is Quebec City. You're looking at the Quebec Parliament building over there. And this is from when you get to the top of the upper town, the beginning of the upper town. That's where this picture is from. Oh, Canada. It isn't Canada yet, but the English and French are fighting over this area of land in Quebec. And there's a wall. Now, the French figured out the upper part of Quebec, where the people live with money, the upper part of Quebec was safe. They built this entire wall around the St. Lawrence River, and it would be very tough to climb this wall. And then where the wall ends, there's a bunch of cliffs. And, you know, the British are not going to climb the cliffs because that's absolutely ridiculous. They're slippery and they're craggy and all that. So the French figure, we got it all figured out. We don't have to finish the wall. We got it all figured out. We got the cliffs next to it, and it'll be fine. It'll be fine, except it wasn't. The General Montcalm, who was defending Quebec, is defeated on the Plains of Abraham by the English on September 13th, 1759. Not only is he defeated, he received his mortal wounds on the Plains of Abraham. In 1759, the British, under the command of General James Wolfe, besieged Quebec City for 3 months. The city was defended by the French general, Marquis de Montcalm. And that is the Plains of Abraham today. It's a big field. It was Abraham's farm. Behind there is the Frontenac Hotel, Chateau Frontenac. And this is where the decisive battle for North America is fought. Well, maybe not for North America, but certainly the colonies that the British claimed: Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick wasn't around in those days, along with Prince Edward Island, and certainly the southern colonies. And here's the view from the wall, looking down at the St. Lawrence Seaway. As you can see, you have to climb, and this is where you have to climb the wall, and the wall's not here anymore. This is where the cliffs are. And so the British sailed down to here in the dark of night, in the middle of the picture, and British soldiers climb up the cliffs. They catch Montcalm and his men, totally unaware of what's going on. 15 minutes, the battle is over. Quebec City. In 1605, the French colonists established the first permanent European settlement in future Canada, and the first north of Florida at Port Royal. And that would become Acadia over at Nova Scotia. Louisbourg, Nova Scotia, French settlement in 1713. 1730, it becomes the biggest military fortress in North America. It would fall to the British in 1758. The 1713 Treaty of Utrecht gave Cape Breton and Prince Edward Island to the French. So the French and the English are having all of these wars that lead to the French-Indian War. And that is the new fort up there in Louisbourg, 1/4 the size. It's a tourist attraction now up in Cape Breton in Nova Scotia. Louisbourg was captured by the British in 1758. It was demolished, some of it reconstructed. Longfellow, you remember Evangeline? Well, Longfellow wrote Evangeline about what was called the quote-unquote exile, which really was ethnic cleansing by the Brits of the French in Nova Scotia. It got really nasty over there. So Quebec is English. Nova Scotia, English. It's almost over. The French are gone, and the English almost can settle down to a life without wars in North America. That is the lighthouse up by Louisbourg. But if you ever go through Halifax, you will see this thing, and I call it, but you know what, we're sorry. All these little monuments of we're sorry we did this, we're sorry we did that, we're sorry we did this. And if you take a look at this picture up in Nova Scotia, which is up on top, you will see that when the ethnic cleansing took place up in Nova Scotia, people were put on boats and sent down to a little island in Halifax, in the harbor in Halifax. If you survive that island, and most didn't, and it's very little, you would be shipped out elsewhere. And some of the people who were shipped out were sent to the Louisiana Territory, which was owned by France at that point, and that's why American has Cajun culture. The French and Indian War finally ends. In 1763. In England defeats the French in Canada, the Mississippi, the Great Lakes line. The English take Canada, and they say, hey, that's it. We're in control. French are gone. Now we got to pay for the war. And this is where George Washington gets very upset. Washington never got his commission in the English army, despite being the commander-in-chief of all forces in defense of Her Majesty's colony in Virginia. The war is done, and Washington is becoming agitated, along with a lot of the other English colonists in the southern colonies, and also Nova Scotia. There's all kind of tension because England has to pay off for all these wars that they had fought, and we need to collect taxes. Where can we get taxes? We know where we could get the taxes. We could get them from the southern colonies and the northern colonies. And England decides, hey, you know what? Time to pay taxes. Got to pay for the war. The Treaty of Paris ends the French and Indian War between Great Britain and France. Great Britain is not engaged in any wars with any country for the first time in more than 50 years. And Parliament is able to turn its attention to regulating the empire, especially the two colonies, the northern colony, which is now Canada, and the southern colony, now the United States. The 7 Years' War, that conflict with France, Britain incurred an enormous debt and looked to the American colonies to help pay for the war. And the southern colonists were in no hurry to help pay off the war. They were watching closely in the South. If you go back in history, Nova Scotia, now it's Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Nova Scotia was just across the river from what is now Maine, but in those days was Massachusetts. And so south of the river that separates now Maine from New Brunswick and down to Boston, hey, they know what's going on because their brethren in the north are telling them, hey, the English had pulled out their best troops. They won in Quebec. They chased the French from Nova Scotia. They don't need troops here anymore. And we're paying for their wars. In 1763, Washington begins to get very upset because the English Parliament issued the Proclamation of 1763, and that prohibited the settlement in the American colonies west of the Appalachian Mountains. Hey, George and his friends, they want to go west of the Appalachians, see what's there, and maybe take the land for themselves. The proclamation is greatly resented in Virginia, where Washington lives. 1765, English Parliament imposes the Stamp Act for taxing American colonies. Patrick Henry is very, very upset. And he introduces the Stamp Act resolves in the Virginia House of Burgesses. These resolves challenge Great Britain's right to impose the tax. Well, wait a minute. I've heard that before, haven't you? 1652, you can't tax us without representation. You can't tax us. Maybe Patrick Henry got the same info that Thomas Jefferson got, because he introduces this thing that says, hey, you can't tax us without representation. 1766, Parliament repeals the Stamp Act but passes the Declaratory Act, which asserts Great Britain's right to pass any laws governing the American colonies. And the American colonists are getting more and more upset. After all, remember what happened in Barbados? 1767, the English Parliament imposes the Townshend duties, taxing imports of tea, glass, paper, lead, and paint in the American colonies. Taxation without representation, taxation without representation. Remember what they did? Oh, all those years ago, 115 years ago in Barbados? And the Americans start, the colonists, Southern colonists start thinking about that. Washington also may have known, as a politician, that the English pulled their best troops out of North America. By the late 1760s, Washington, who really has not done anything since the 1750s, although he does start at the House of Burgesses in 1759 when he gets married, he said, I've had enough. That's it. I've had enough. The rising taxes, I don't want to pay taxes. I don't want to pay taxes. They're imposed on us for paying for their war. And he came to believe, you know what? It's in the best interest of the colonists to say, bye, England. Nice knowing you. We have our own land here. Maybe it's time to declare independence from England. He being Washington, opposed the Stamp Act and the Townshend Act and the Intolerable Act. Anything that Britain sent down, whatever it is, he's against it. Well, that was Professor Wagstaff in Horse Feathers, in Duck Soup, Marx Brothers. Anyway, so Washington decides by about 1770, it's time to look for allies. And I'm a reporter. That's what I do. I've been on TV doing punditry. I've done radio forever. I wrote for the Bergen Record. And you know what? I decided I needed to get a story. So I'm out in Pittsburgh 2 years ago. And I see George. He's having a meeting with a local Indian guy. And I'm eavesdropping. I want to know what George is saying. And basically, George is saying, help us, and we'll do something for you. Just be on our side, because it's getting too bad. The English are just imposing too much on us. We need to get out, but we need allies. In 1773, the English Parliament passes the Tea Act, and that precipitates the Boston Tea Party, which takes place in Boston in December of 1773. A party of nearly 50 men disguised as Indians, led by Samuel Adams, before he became a beer, boards ships, breaks open 343 chests of tea, and empties them into the Boston Harbor. Hey, for $10, you could do the same thing in the Boston Harbor. Now, all you have to do is cross the bridge to get it to Atlantic Avenue in Boston from South Boston. The cruise ships are over there. And you, for $10, you give the $10, you go on the ship and toss some tea. We live the experience today. Seeking to boost the troubled East India Company, the British Parliament adjusted import duties. Now, the consignees in Charlottetown, South Carolina, New York, and Philadelphia just rejected the tea shipments. But the merchants in Boston said, no, we're gonna take it in. It's not a problem. We're gonna take it in. And on the night of December 16th, 1773, Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty boarded the 3 ships in the Boston Harbor and threw the chest of tea overboard. And George III was really mad, really mad, because, and so was the English Parliament, because this resulted in the passage of the Coercive Acts of 1774. And they were intended to punish the colony, Massachusetts, and in Boston particularly, both because of the Tea Party, and they had all these guys like Samuel Adams running around, Paul Revere, and All these others are just running around saying, hey, let's get out of here. Let's get out of here. So, yeah, let's punish Boston because those guys are troublemakers and there's too much resistance and we'll just punish Boston. Now, they're punishing Boston. And meanwhile, every summer I go up to the Berkshires because my wife's cousin has a place up there. So I hang out in Great Barrington, among other places. And there's kind of a rivalry between Eastern Massachusetts and Western Massachusetts as to where the first resistance was. Now, you could say the first resistance was the Boston Tea Party. But up in Great Barrington in front of the courthouse, there's this rock with this inscription in there. Near this spot stood the first courthouse of Berkshire County, erected 1764. Here on August 16, 1774, occurred the first open resistance to British rule in America. Now, that kind of confuses me because I learned all about the Boston Tea Party back in school, and I knew nothing about this resistance over in Great Barrington in the Berkshires. Something does not add up here. So where was the first open resistance? Was it Patrick Henry? Was it the Tea Party, or was it up in the Berkshires in Great Barrington? Historical minds need to know. There would be skirmishes between the British troops and the colonial militiamen in Lexington and Concord. In April 1775, that kicked off the armed conflict, better known as the shot heard round the world. It's been a loud shot if they could hear it in India. Meanwhile, in 1775, the Second Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia. Peyton Randolph is reelected the president of the Congress, and George Washington shows up complete in old uniform. He's ready to report to duty. He is ready to lead the troops. He's the commander-in-chief of the American forces. But to be quite honest with you, there was nobody else. Nobody else was going to take the job. And, George looked the part. He was 6'4". He was a tough guy 20 years ago. If you wanted to desert, you faced the possibility of being hanged. And so he looked the part. And he came there dressed for the part, and they gave him the part. Meanwhile, King George declares the American colonies in rebellion. Washington appears at the Second Continental Congress complete in military uniform, signaling he's prepared for war. He had the prestige, he had the military experience, and he had charisma. It's all yours, George. Do it. Nobody else wants it. And, look, he had the background. He closely observed the British military tactics. Well, that was 1751. He did gain an insight into their strengths and weaknesses, which would prove invaluable during the Revolutionary War. He also had some allies, as you saw back in 1770. He went up to Pittsburgh. Remember, he built fortifications up there, so he knew some of the people up there still after 15 years. And he said, hey, help us out, help us out. And he did get some of those guys on his side. Washington's key ability was to keep the struggling colonial army together. His troops were poorly trained. They lacked food, didn't have shoes, some of them, in the winter. They lacked ammunition and other supplies, but he was able to give them direction and motivation to keep them going. He would go right in the middle of battle, and he was a target, being 6'4", standing tall on his horse. The revolution kicks off, and there is the Liberty Bell. And we'll talk a little bit about the Declaration of Independence before I get to the end of the war. That was done by around July 2nd, 1776. And I have this question for you that you can answer now in chat, or you can answer afterwards or bring it up. Was George Washington a traitor? Was Benjamin Franklin a traitor? Was Thomas Jefferson a traitor? Were these guys traitors? The Declaration of Independence, of course, is written by Jefferson. And a lot of that stuff written by Jefferson was written by, the loyalists to the king, who fled to Barbados. And Jefferson lifted it from somebody, or somebody gave it to him, and put it into the Declaration of Independence. One thing about the Declaration of Independence, if you've ever looked at it carefully, you will see all the names on there. And you'll see John Hancock has the biggest name on there, or the biggest signature on there. John Hancock was the richest guy in the Americas back in 1776, and he knew something else. He knew that George III was nearsighted, and he wanted to make sure that George III saw his name, the biggest name of all, on the Declaration of Independence, hence the old expression, put your John Hancock there. These guys were sick of paying taxes. But who were these guys? Well, these guys were basically landowners. That was it. They were the only ones who had any kind of power in the United States when it formed, the landowners. You know, women really had no rights. Black slaves were considered 3/5 man or 3/5 human being. And these guys didn't want to pay their taxes, and they wanted this land all for themselves. And they got people from Germany, von Steuben, to help out. They got great deal of assistance from France, from friendly Indians. France was looking for a pound of retribution anyway, getting back at the English. So the war takes shape. It's fought between literally 1775 and 1781. In fact, up here in Westchester, up by Dobbs Ferry, there's a rock, which I should actually put into this presentation, which talked about the line that Washington and his men had from New York marched down to Yorktown, which started roughly up around Dobbs Ferry. 1781, the Americans beat the English at Yorktown. The war is about done, and George Washington's job is about over. So George meets the troops down at Fraunces Tavern. What do you expect from ex-British patriots? We're going to meet at the tavern. And the tavern is the seat of the government of the United States when it forms. Hey, they were English after all. So they're there at Fraunces Tavern. Washington says goodbye. He's at this point 51 years old. It's 1783. And he says, hey, I've served my country. It's time to go home to see Martha. And it's time to tend to my plantation. The tavern becomes the seat of the government. Hey, why not? Work during the day and drink all night. Today, it's a bar and a museum. Eventually, the capital would move to Princeton, to Philadelphia, and to Washington, D.C. After much reluctance, George Washington, who's now in retirement, and he's now 55 years old, and just kind of hanging out down with Martha, down in Virginia, he's persuaded to attend the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia during the summer of 1787 as a delegate from Virginia. And yeah, he's kind of reluctant until he's unanimously elected the president of the convention. And then George swings into operation. He wasn't holding back. He held considerable criticism of the Articles of Confederation of the 13 colonies, for it was a weak central government, and he referred to the Articles as no more than a rope of sand to support a new nation. He couldn't get money when he needed money, and I'm going to give you an example of that. Nova Scotia is right across the way from what was then Massachusetts. And the Nova Scotians at that point were kind of on the fence. Should we go with this southern colonists because we want independence as well, or should we stick with the Brits? And they kind of were leaning to go with the 13 colonists until there was some double crossing of a bunch of things. And Washington is looking around. They have Halifax, great port, never freezes Halifax, and which was important. But Washington's looking around. He said, we got Boston, we got New York, we got Philadelphia, we got Charleston. So we got 4 really good ports. Halifax would be a great port too. Never freezes in the winter. It's great. And you could ship stuff to that part of the world. And it's also closest to England. But he didn't have money for ammunition to go into Nova Scotia. And he was thinking about, well, maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't, but he couldn't get any money from anybody. So he decided it wasn't worth the cost of buying bullets to try to get Nova Scotia. So he's looking at this and he says, no more than a rope of sand. We need something else. And he gets into action in a hurry. His view for the need of a strong federal government grew out of the recent war, as well as the inability of the Continental Congress to rally the states to provide for the needs of the military. Hey, some states gave. Other states said, no, we're not going to give, even though, or colonies, even though we're all in this together. Washington would eventually become president, and that is Federal Hall down in Lower Manhattan. And it's a couple of years ago when I could safely go to Federal Hall. And that is where Washington takes the oath of office to become the first president of the United States in 1789. He beats out John Adams for that. Adams would become his vice president. Now, George Washington is responsible for how the government looks today on the federal level in the executive branch. He appoints every high-ranking official in the executive and judicial branches, and he shaped numerous political practices. Washington seemed to enjoy the fact that he is building this country, and he's got an ally with him too. This guy here, before he became a Broadway sensation, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton is his trusted aide from the war, and Hamilton is a really smart guy. He comes from Nevis, St. Kitts and Nevis down in the Caribbean. He's got kind of a background that people are still trying to figure out, but somehow he ends up with Washington, and he's got Washington's ear. And he tells Washington, well, hey, you know what? These are the economic policies that we should be doing. The federal government should assume the debt of state governments and establish the first bank of the United States. They're still arguing over this all these years later. He would eventually come up with the idea and establish the United States Mint, and he would also establish the first bank of the United States and also the United States Customs Service. He would also have a newspaper called the New York Post, which he started in 1803. It is the longest continuous newspaper operation in the United States. Washington loved Hamilton, and he probably would have paid to see the Hamilton on Broadway. Hamilton, as you know, told Jefferson, if you've seen the Broadway play, but you didn't have to do that, hey, you know what? We'll keep the money here. We'll keep the money here. This is the Alexander Hamilton Custom House in Lower Manhattan, part of the Smithsonian Institute. But anyway, he said, we'll keep the money here. You know, the money will stay here, and take the government where you want. Take it down to Washington, D.C. It was Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson who came up with the solution. New York would be the financial engine of the United States. Hamilton lived in New York. And Washington is kind of halfway between Massachusetts and Georgia, which was the United States in those days. And it's easier to get to from the south than New York. And we'll get to swampland in Washington. We'll carve it out of Maryland, and we'll make it a federal district. And yeah, eventually we'll call it Washington. So Hamilton's feeding Washington ideas, and Washington is listening to those ideas. Hamilton would, of course, eventually meet his end, a duel with Aaron Burr. The United States and Britain, the hostilities between the two countries at that point never, ever, ever ended. With the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783, there would be a do-over, the War of 1812. And the Americans won the big battle. They won the Battle of the Navy. And at that point, the Brits were considered to have the most capable Navy in the world. So the War of 1812 really didn't prove all that much, other than, it's a minor war, other than the Americans stood on their own 2 feet and were able to defend the country that they started in 1776. George is one of the greatest presidents ever in the poll of historians. His stay in Barbados was extraordinarily important. This is Boston. This is where every year in Boston on the 4th of July, somebody pops out of that window onto that balcony and reads the Declaration of Independence. It's done annually, and Queen Elizabeth happened to be in the country, Queen Elizabeth II, in 1976, the 200th anniversary of the American independence, and she said, let's, you know, auld lang syne, let's let bygones be bygones. The Queen spent the 4th of July in Boston in 1776 when America celebrated its bicentennial. A couple of days later, President Gerald Ford and Queen Elizabeth II were at the White House, toasted one another in Washington a few days later. Britain now is a key ally of the Americans. Britain actually during the Civil War engaged with the North, supporting the South in some battles, and also the Brits allowed Bermuda, Hamilton, Bermuda, to as a munitions place, so the South could get munitions against the North. And there were some stuff that went on also during the Revolutionary War with munitions that went to the North, or rather the Americans, colonists over at Bermuda. It's a fascinating history about how Bermuda was tied up in the Revolutionary War as well as the Civil War. So if you take it in total, the Treaty of the Treaty of Ostens and the Charter of Barbados, which you never learn in school. You never learn that in school. I never ever encountered it until I was in Bridgetown and Barbados. Is a key element that in American history. Washington goes to Barbados and he learns about the military and he uses those tactics or knows about the British tactics 25, 30 years later, which would help him in the American Revolution. Somehow Jefferson got a hold of the Charter of Barbados and basically wrote it as his own, or some of it as his own. The odd thing about the Treaty of Ostens is you cannot find all that much on the Treaty of Ostens. You cannot really find that Jefferson, let's say, borrowed some ideas to make his own in the Declaration of Independence. And of course, there was that second war that the Americans, the War of 1812, held their own. The Americans invaded Ontario. The Brits burnt down the White House, but there's the Treaty of Ghent in 1814, and that ends the hostilities, except nobody told that to Andrew Jackson, who had the Battle of New Orleans, which was a waste of a battle. But it wasn't all that much of a waste if you think of the singer Johnny Horton, because in 1959, Johnny Horton had a #1 hit called The Battle of New Orleans, and it made his career. I want to thank you so much. Deanna, I want to thank you for inviting me. And I hope that people enjoyed it. And let's take some questions. And we will, let me get rid of the screen share and we can open up everything. And I'm going to end the recording because you're going to have some privacy. And we could talk about this as well. So I am going to end the recording and